Nigeria.
Welcome to AI Podcast Nigeria.
If you're looking for a fresh perspective on Nigeria, a chance to really dive deep into its culture and its people,
And maybe get hungry along the way.
definitely get hungry.
Mm.
I highly recommend checking out Podcast Nigeria. I think you'd be surprised and inspired by what you hear.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll make you want to book a flight to Lagos.
Huh. Maybe so.
All right.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Hey everyone, welcome back.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that's been causing a lot of controversy in Nigeria.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
It really is, and it all revolves around singer Scales and his reaction to the death of an EFCC officer during a raid.
It's a tough one for sure.
It is, and Scales' reaction isn't coming out of nowhere. This is rooted in a personal experience that he had with the EFCC back in 2023.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of look at both sides of this story, what Scales went through, but also kind of the bigger picture of the EFCC and what their role is in Nigeria and how they're viewed.
Right, because it's kind of a complex issue, I think, to start off with. We'll look at, Scales' tweets from January 20th of this year, 2025, and, he didn't hold back at all about the news of this officer's death. He even used a phrase that really caught my eye when I first saw it. He said they had it coming.
Yeah, those are some pretty strong words.
Yeah.
You can really tell that this is coming from, a deep personal place for him. This isn't just, a random comment that he's making.
Right. And so to kind of understand where that's coming from, we have to rewind back to 2023 when Scales had his own experience with the EFCC. They raided his home, and his account of this raid is really kind of chilling. He talks about being at home with his family, his newborn child, his mother.
Yeah, this is not someone who's, a known criminal or anything. This is, a family man at home with his family.
And then suddenly, there's this really forceful entry into his home, people breaking down his door. He describes seeing 4 AK-47s, 3 sledgehammers. It just sounds so intense.
Yeah, that would be terrifying, right?
It would be. And he even talks about, waking up between 4 and 6 a.m., constantly checking for intruders. Even to this day, years later, that kind of experience, and it really sticks with you.
Oh, absolutely. It really, shatters your sense of security. You don't feel safe, even in your own home.
And it sounds like Scales really feels like he was targeted unfairly.
He's always maintained that he's innocent and that he was not involved in any fraud, which is what the EFCC, is supposed to be, investigating.
Right. So it's like, on one hand, you have Scales who feels like he was, completely wronged by this experience. And then you have the EFCC, whose job it is to fight corruption. But, they've also faced a lot of criticism for their methods.
Yeah, it's like, where do you draw the line, right?
Exactly. And, in Scales' case, he specifically calls out this officer, Mr. Femi, as the one who led the raid on his home. And he even expresses, a desire for, bad things to happen to Mr. Femi and his family. This is really personal for him.
Yeah, this goes beyond just disagreeing with law enforcement. This is deeply personal.
Yeah, and it's like this raid just completely shattered his trust, not just in the individuals involved, but in the whole system that they represent.
Right, like how can you trust the people who are supposed to be protecting you if they're the ones that are breaking down your door and terrorizing your family?
Right, so Scales' experience really raises some serious questions about the EFCC, what they do and why they've been so controversial.
Yeah, so I think to really understand his reaction, we need to look into what is the EFCC? What do they actually do?
Right, like why are they raiding people's homes in the middle of the night?
So the EFCC, it stands for the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. And they're basically Nigeria's main agency for fighting financial crimes. So, things like corruption, money laundering, that kind of stuff.
So they have a really important job then.
They do, especially in a country where corruption is such a big problem.
Right, but here's the thing. As we've said, they've also been criticized a lot for their approach, especially, during these raids.
Right. People describe them as being, heavy-handed, intrusive, sometimes even violating people's rights.
And that's where it gets really complicated, right? Because you have Scales, who is, traumatized by this experience, lashing out after hearing about the death of an officer. And then you have the EFCC who, they're trying to fight corruption, but are they doing it the right way,
Right. Or the methods that they're using justified?
It's like a real moral dilemma.
Yeah, it is. How do you make sure that, these institutions have the power to fight crime, but without, going too far and violating people's rights?
I mean, it's a question that a lot of countries are struggling with.
It is, and it's a tough one to answer.
Yeah. So we've got Scales dealing with this trauma and anger, and then you've got the EFCC officers, working in this system that maybe encourages this kind of aggressive behavior. I mean, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure.
It is. And before we go any further, I kind of want to turn it over to you, the listener.
Yeah.
What are your initial reactions to this story? What stands out to you so far?
Yeah, what are your thoughts on Scales' experience and this whole situation with the EFCC?
As we're talking about this, it occurs to me that, Scales' criticism of the EFCC, it isn't really isolated, right?
No, not at all. I mean, you see similar reports, allegations about their methods all the time, especially with these raids.
Right. Just makes you wonder, how do you actually effectively combat these financial crimes while still respecting individual rights?
Yeah, how do you avoid these heavy-handed tactics that we've been talking about?
Right. And when he described the raid, boosting into his home in the middle of the night with AK-47 sledgehammers, I mean, that's intense.
It is. It's unsettling, to say the least.
It is. How do you reconcile that kind of approach with, justice and respecting citizens?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, it's something that law enforcement agencies all over the world struggle with.
Yeah.
You want to be effective, but you don't want to overreach and violate people's liberties.
Right. And it sounds like the EFCC, maybe they've strayed a bit too far into that gray area, at least in some cases.
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, Scale said it himself. He felt like the EFCC officers were acting like criminals themselves, scaring innocent people.
That's a strong statement.
It is. And I think it echoes what a lot of people are saying about the EFCC.
Yeah, and it brings up this really important point about oversight and accountability. They have so much power.
Right.
And with that power comes responsibility.
Absolutely. But how do we actually reform organizations like this?
Yeah.
How do we prevent these traumatic situations while still making sure that they can do their job effectively?
It's a tough balance.
It is.
I think a good place to start would be open and honest dialogue.
Yeah.
Really examine these criticisms and commit to finding a better way.
Right. It's not about, weakening them or preventing them from fighting corruption.
No, exactly.
It's about doing it the right way.
Exactly.
I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some ways we could actually achieve that balance?
Well, one really important thing is transparency.
Okay.
The EFCC's operations need to be more open.
So people understand what they're doing and why.
Yeah, exactly. And that will build trust and make sure they're accountable.
So it's not just about what they do, but also how they talk about it.
Precisely.
Okay, so transparency is key. What else?
Another thing is training. The officers need to be trained not just on investigative techniques.
But on the ethics of it all.
Exactly. Human rights.
Okay.
Legal limitations of their power.
So basically they need to understand that their actions have consequences?
Right, and that they need to treat people with respect.
I imagine that could really help to prevent situations like what happened to Scales.
It could. It's about creating a culture of respect within the organization.
So transparency training. What about structural changes or legal reforms?
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a system for addressing complaints.
Right, so if someone feels like they were wronged, they have some recourse.
Exactly. There should be an independent body that can investigate.
Okay, so it sounds like what we're talking about is a pretty comprehensive approach. Internal changes, external oversight. It's a big task.
It is. It's not a quick fix.
Definitely not. It's systemic change.
Exactly. And it's about making sure that people like Scales feel like their rights are protected even when they're being investigated.
This has been really eye-opening. It's clear that this is a really complex situation with a lot of layers.
It is.
And it's a good reminder that even institutions that are supposed to protect us can sometimes go too far.
Right.
And that we need to hold them accountable.
Absolutely.
So before we wrap up, I want to turn it back to you, the listener, as we've been talking. What's been going through your mind? What are your thoughts and questions about this balance between law enforcement and individual rights?
Okay, so we're back. And as we wrap this up, I think it's important to remember kind of where this whole conversation started, with Scales' reaction to that officer's death.
Yeah, those words, they had it coming. I mean, they definitely got people's attention and caused a lot of anger.
They did. And, it's easy to hear that and just be outraged. But I think, as we've talked about, he's speaking from a place of deep pain and trauma,
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And even though, we might not agree with his words, I think we have to acknowledge the issues that he's bringing to light.
Right. It's like his experience kind of forced us to have this conversation about power and the potential for abuse, and how trauma can really have a lasting impact.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, you know, could something like what happened to Scales be prevented? Are there ways to change how these organizations operate to reduce that risk?
That's a big question, and I think it's one that we all have a stake in. We all want to live in a society where justice prevails and individual rights are respected.
Absolutely. And finding that balance, it's not easy,
It's not.
but it's something that we all need to work towards.
It is. One of the things that really hit home for me throughout this whole deep dive is just the human cost of all of this.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in these abstract discussions about law enforcement and corruption and all that, but we can't forget that there are real people who are affected by these decisions and these actions.
Right. These aren't just theoretical problems. They have very real consequences for people.
Yeah, Scales' story is a perfect example of that. His trauma, his anger, his fear, it's all very real.
It is, and it's something that we need to keep in mind as we think about these issues.
Absolutely. So I guess to wrap this up, I want to ask you, the listener, what are you taking away from this conversation? What resonated with you? What questions are you left with?
Yeah, this is really just the beginning.
Yeah.
Keep thinking about this. Keep learning, keep questioning.
Yeah, because this story, it's just one example of these bigger challenges that we face when it comes to building a just and equitable society.
It is, and it's a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe encouraged you to learn more about these issues.
Yeah, and to stay engaged in this conversation.
Until next time, keep diving deep.